Hello, I'm Ritula Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast on Wednesday, the 21st of March. On the programme, Mark Zuckerberg's admitted that Facebook made mistakes that allowed a political consultancy to exploit the data of millions of users. We ask if the deal where users give information in return for internet services needs to change. Also, 101 schoolgirls abducted by Boko Haram last month have come home. But is the Nigerian government doing enough to protect children? And we hear about a silent movie that predicted the rise of the Nazis that's been found, restored and has been screened in Vienna. Where's Mark or where's Zuck are phrases that have been trending on the internet in the past couple of days. The Facebook founder, Mark Zuckerberg, had been noticeably absent amid the growing furore about the social media giant's involvement with the data analytics company Cambridge Analytica. Political and media attention on both sides of the Atlantic has focused on the allegation that Facebook user data was acquired illicitly and passed to Cambridge Analytica in 2014. Both companies deny any wrongdoing. But tonight, Mark Zuckerberg issued a statement, on his Facebook page, of course, which was an explanation of his company's actions. Here's a short extract from the beginning.
We have a responsibility to protect your data, and if we can't, then we don't deserve to serve you. I've been working to understand exactly what happened and how to make sure this doesn't happen again. The good news is that the most important actions to prevent this from happening again today we have already taken years ago. But we also made mistakes. There's more to do, and we need to step up and do it.
Well, more about that in a moment. But here in the UK, a former senior Facebook manager has been telling MPs on the Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee that he warned the company that users' data wasn't safe more than 6 years ago. Sandy Parakilas, speaking via video link, said that data protection wasn't a priority for the social network.
If what you're saying is they take the technical security of their systems very seriously, yes, they absolutely do. And then you're also saying, but they don't take ensuring that people's data is protected overall, including outside of their systems. I agree, they do not take that seriously enough.
Well, in his statement, Mark Zuckerberg addressed his company's approach to user data quite directly. I asked our business editor, Simon Jack, to explain what he'd said.
Mark Zuckerberg finally has said something. What he said is that we have a responsibility to protect your data. We have tightened it up in the past and we need to go further. He's also laid out a timeline pertaining to this particular bit of data, 50 million Facebook users' accounts, which was obtained by Cambridge Analytica, which people have alleged was used in the Trump election campaign. And he said that we tightened up these steps in 2014 so that people couldn't get this kind of access. But they do admit there were sort of suitcases full of data still lying around out there, which no one had checked and find out what people were doing with that. And it's worth remembering that in 2013, when this data was first scraped, Donald J. Trump was not even a very credible presidential candidate. Now, it doesn't mean this data wasn't used, but it probably didn't start life as a install Trump in the White House project. I think that's very important to see. They then say, Mark Zuckerberg says in this letter, he's going to investigate all apps that had access to data before we tightened up in 2014. We'll do a full audit of any company which has a lot of activity. If they don't submit an audit, their apps will be banned from the site. Second, developers who invent all these apps will have less access to data. For example, if you haven't used an app on your phone for 3 months, developers won't have access to any of your information. And when you sign into an app, the only information they'll be able to get is your name, profile photo, and email address. Thirdly, they're going to make sure that you understand which of the apps that you've downloaded have access to your data, and they will put a little button at the top of your news feed. You can click on that and revoke the access to some of those apps. So it's a three-pronged approach. It's not really a mea culpa. It's we really care about this. What I think is that people will say, here's a written statement he posted on Facebook. Why isn't he doing a press conference? Why isn't he appearing in person? This Where's Mark movement, I don't think will be entirely diffused. Facebook has taken a walloping in the stock market since this happened, down $50 billion over the last couple of days. Looking at the share price since this came out, it's up, but only a bit. So in the eyes of investors, there's still a credibility question, there's still a trust issue. So I think that the impact, the reputational damage of this very much lingers.
Simon Jack. Well, the tale that's been uncovered by Channel 4 News and The Guardian's been a sensational one. It includes allegations of sleaze, psychological manipulation and data misuse. It's also raised a question about whether personal data was used to influence the outcome of the US 2016 presidential election or the UK Brexit referendum. In Europe and America, politicians have now begun to investigate those claims. But what's certain is that most of us have given away large amounts of personal information, knowingly or otherwise, to tech companies, which they in turn have used to boost their business model. So is that our new reality, or is there an alternative way forward? Yevgeny Morozov is the author of The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of the Internet and Freedom, and Roger McNamee is an early investor in Facebook and a former mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. I began by asking him if Mark Zuckerberg's response to the crisis had come too late.
Indisputably. I think that not only should he have appeared sooner, that the company should have cooperated with investigators from the beginning. They should have provided access to all of the data related to the 2016 election. They should have reached out to the 126 million people on Facebook and the 20 plus million on Instagram that were touched by the Russian interference and explained to them what happened, give them the examples, and explain that the only way to protect any democracy from external interference, particularly interference designed to suppress the vote, is for everyone to vote.
The quality of that data is still not clear. How effective Cambridge Analytica's work may or may not have been is still not clear. Everybody denies wrongdoing. But Yevgeny Morozov, if I can just bring you in for a moment, you could argue that none of this matters very much. We all gave our data willingly to look at pictures of kittens. Is that something everyone did openly? In a sense, this is the new reality in which we're operating.
Well, I think most of us do give away that data without realizing what value that data has, both politically but also economically. And it's obvious, I think, to anybody who's been watching this space that the fact that they have managed to leverage all that data without anybody asking any questions has quite a bit to do with their tremendous financial success. So in that sense, I think the questions here are not just political about manipulation of elections, even though that, of course, is very important, but they're also about the heart of their business models. And their business models revolve around extracting that data and turning it into useful services, some of them related to artificial intelligence, some of them related to many other very demanded lines of activity. So we have to be asking those questions as well. Most people have no idea how valuable their usage of those platforms for relatively trivial things actually is.
Roger McNamee, you were an early investor in Facebook. You recognised its potential to bring people together, to act as a social function. What changed? When did it stop being part of this open web that we were all celebrating not so long ago?
This is a great question. It's very clear that beginning in 2011, when Facebook signed the consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, which basically said that they needed informed consent to share any user's data, which means they had to explicitly call out the use and inform people and then get an express approval of it. Once they signed that, until 2014, they still allowed applications vendors to harvest friend data using applications like the one that Cambridge Analytica used. And that is a huge problem. And it showed they had no people, apparently. My understanding is they had no people whose job it was to monitor the usage by third parties. So they were cavalierly disregarding their obligations to users, and I'm afraid that had become part of their business plan, that their notion was, we're going to get as big as we can, as fast as we can, and we're not going to accept any friction from regulators or others.
So, Yevgeny Morozov, is this a completely asymmetric game in a sense? The big companies have the data, we want to use the products. What's the answer? Who should be in charge? Who should marshal that data? Who should be the gatekeeper?
Again, I think we have answered that question as a society very prematurely. I think we have accepted the bargain that has been offered to us without thinking about it too much. And the bargain was that we can get a lot of services for free, and those services would be underwritten essentially by advertisers. And we're beginning now to see the consequences of that.
So what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is a somewhat different model where we realize that much of what these big tech companies offer, from Google to Facebook to Amazon to Uber to some extent, is a new form of infrastructure. It's more or less what land was in 17th or 16th century at the beginning of capitalism. And back then we realized that having just a few very powerful people control all that land is actually very bad for the overall development of the economy, because they end up taxing all of us for very productive economic activity. And we did something very smart. We passed laws which redistributed land ownership. And I think we are at a point where we have to start asking questions whether it's time to redistribute ownership over data and a lot of products built with it, like artificial intelligence, not to go towards some centralized Leninist communist model, but to actually accelerate the development of productive forces, which are greatly expressed by this new feudal tech overlords that have come to dominate our economy.
So, Roger McNamee, should we be nationalising these companies somehow, government ownership, or should we be charging people to use?
I
understand. I'm not suggesting that's what you said. I'm putting forward: is one answer possibly to nationalise them, or should we possibly be charging people to use these products rather than relying on advertising?
I think there are a lot of choices. I think in the United States, the last time this came up, which was with the telephone system, the first thing that was done was that they took all of the patents of AT&T and put them in the public domain so any company could use them. That would be a very constructive step that would go a long way towards what Evgeny is talking about. The second thing is, I think the global data protection regulation in Europe is a brilliant idea. Not every part of it is perfect, but this notion that consumers should own their own data and should have privacy rights and control rights, and that the relationship with these companies should be less one-sided. I think that will fix an enormous part of the problem. And I do think that the companies would be well served to experiment with non-advertising based business models, because the problem you had with Cambridge Analytica, and which you have with so many of these things, is really a function of the advertising business model.
Yevgeny Morozov, do you think, though, people can be persuaded to care enough to adopt the kind of changes you're describing? In a few days' time, this will die down, it'll move away from the headlines. Don't we all carry on looking at pictures of people's children and cats?
I don't think it will die down, in part because it's obvious that we have moved beyond just pictures of cats. The digital economy now expands into domains and areas of life in the economy that have previously been quite secure, from energy to education to health to transportation. All of them now represent big interest for technology firms. And all of them are rating products, many of them underwritten by artificial intelligence, which actually will be optimizing those areas and industries and domains. So a lot of people will either lose their jobs because their jobs will be automated away, or they will end up essentially not having any say in how key parts of their life, which health and education definitely are governed, because they'll be governed by private companies and not by actual political entities that we vote for. And again, I disagree somehow with the plan to charge people for the usage of those services, because I think we have paid enough. We have paid enough with our attention. We have paid enough with our data. That data was used by many of those firms to build very sophisticated products of artificial intelligence, which now allows them to monetize our data even more. And I think it's time that we somewhat shift the paradigm and we actually find a way where data belongs to us, and companies that would like to build services on top of that data have to pay a licensing fee, which will actually pay for the provision of many other goods and services.
Roger McNamee, very briefly, do you see any lasting damage to Facebook as a result of this?
Oh, I think the loss of trust is really extreme and represents a huge threat to the company's long-term viability. And my hope is that Facebook finds a way to change its strategy so fundamentally that it can regain trust, because I love the product. I hate the business model, but I love the product. And I would love to see it continue to be successful. But if they continue on the current course and speed, I think really difficult times are ahead.
That was Roger McNamee, who was a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg, and you also heard from the author of The Net Delusion, Evgeny Morozov. Boko Haram never explained why it had abducted yet another group of Nigerian girls back in February. But today, 101 of them were returned to their northeastern town of Dapchi. Aisha Derry was among those who'd been kidnapped. Home again today, she described what happened when they were taken.
At the school, we could hear lots of gunshots in the air. We were totally confused. some Boko Haram people entered through a school gate and we started to run, but they told us to stop running or they would shoot us. Then we stopped and they asked us to get into trucks and they took us away.
Well, the students also said that 5 of the others died in captivity and one, the only Christian in the group, was still being held. The freed girls have now left Dapchi and are flying to Abuja to meet President Muhammadu Buhari. It's been reported that some of the Boko Haram fighters shouted "God is greatest" as they drove the girls into the town in a convoy of trucks. They dropped them off and then left. The Nigerian Information Minister, Lai Mohammed, said military operations in the area were paused to allow Boko Haram to bring the girls home.
It was agreed that there will be no force, no confrontation. So that's why it was possible for them to drop the girls. Don't forget that the lives of these children are much more important to us than any cheap military victory.
It was the biggest abduction by the Islamist militants since 2014, when 270 girls were taken from the town of Chibok. That was an event that provoked international outrage. Well, Yvonne Idahosa is an organiser and activist for the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, which has been fighting for the freedom of the Chibok girls. How did she feel about today's release?
I'm actually quite elated because I think any family who's been waiting for any period of time for their daughters in the hands of terrorists must have been in a state of torture. And so I'm really, really, really happy and thrilled for the families who did get their daughters back. Obviously, my heart goes out to the families who, at least 5 of who we believe, have passed on as a result of the abduction on February 19th. But I think overall, putting that aside, the reality is that the abduction and the return of these girls certainly raises a lot of questions.
Well, one of the questions is they were abducted a month ago. Do you think some money may have exchanged hands in order to secure their release or some kind of deal?
Right. The government is saying that there was no ransom. So perhaps it was a prisoner swap or some other sort of negotiation. But in my opinion, based on what has happened in the past and what seems to be the modus operandi of these sorts of operations, it's likely that there was some exchange of funds.
How would you compare this to what happened to the Chibok girls? Was it a similar abduction? Did the events unfold in a similar way?
It certainly seems that way. From my perspective, it's eerily reminiscent of what happened in Chibok. It was almost like all of this is happening from a script, that it was rather unfortunate. In my opinion, it was morally reprehensible for our government to leave young children, vulnerable to being attacked in the first place. I think the only difference is obviously the amount of time that has gone by. Obviously, it only took a month to get the majority of these girls back. And we know that in a couple of days, at least 112 other families would be waiting for 4 years to get their children back as a result of the abduction in Chibok.
Do you think that Boko Haram has evolved in any way, or is it still the same outfit that took those girls from Chibok in 2014?
I don't think they've evolved in a positive sense. It seems like the playbook is still exactly the same. The fact that the government has not been able to aggressively and convincingly address the menace that Boko Haram is, I think has served as fuel and has created a lot more audacity in their actions. So being able to come into any village or town and to be able to conduct a mass abduction without being apprehended, being able to brazenly walk back into the same town and return the girls without any kind of military intervention. I think it's indicative of the fact that Boko Haram is on the contrary, actually gaining a lot more ground than the military would like for the average Nigerian to actually believe.
That's Yvonne Idahosa from Bring Back Our Girls. More than a dozen women have accused President Trump of sexual misconduct. Now, one of them is taking her message one step further by running for office. Rachel Crooks is standing as a Democrat for the Ohio state legislature. It seems like a long shot in her rural Ohio district, which President Trump won by more than 20 points in 2016. No Democrats held the position since 1994. But Ms. Crooks hopes the recognition she's gained from her personal story, along with a pledge to tackle income inequality and improve education, will be a winning formula. The BBC's Tara McKelvey has this report from Ohio.
So we have 4 cardboard postal service boxes that are full of thank you cards for our donors.
Rachel Crooks was at her house in Tiffin, Ohio, going through some boxes. She's running for the state legislature, and she says that she's received donations from more than 1,000 people.
They're coming from all over the U.S., so it's really humbling to know that people are paying attention to Ohio and to me in this race.
People know about Rachel Crooks, and they've heard about her campaign because of a story she told about meeting Trump more than a decade ago in New York. She's one of the women who's come forward and accused him of sexual misconduct.
I worked in Trump Tower immediately after I graduated from college.
She used to see Trump waiting for the elevator, and one morning she decided to introduce herself.
That's when the infamous encounter happened. He just sort of held onto my hand and kissed my cheeks, but started to, insert small talk and then just kept pulling me in and kissing my cheeks and then finally kissed me on the lips. So it was really awful and upsetting.
I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet.
It sounded like the kind of thing that he described in the Access Hollywood tape, the one that was leaked to the media during the presidential campaign.
This is locker room talk.
During one of the debates, he said he wouldn't actually do something like that.
And I was embarrassed by it, but I have tremendous respect for women.
Have you ever done those
women
things?
Have respect for me. And I will tell you, no, I have not.
That's when she decided to speak out.
He called me a liar.
Trump had said on Twitter that the incident she described didn't actually happen. She fired back, also on Twitter. Here's what she said.
It's liars like you in politics that have made me want to run for office myself.
In America, when women are called, we show up.
The election's not till November, but Rachel Crooks already has a campaign ad.
Because the people in this part of Ohio deserve better. They deserve a government that's focused on creating good-paying jobs, not giving massive tax breaks to the wealthiest few.
Trump won here by a big margin, and a lot of people are skeptical about her campaign.
Paper and ink.
David Kale owns a bookstore in downtown Tiffin. It looks a little musty inside, and on the morning that I was there, someone called and asked if the new issue of Trains magazine had come in.
It does concern me that she is apparently a candidate because of her alleged encounter with the president before he was president.
Tiffin's a town that's rooted in the past, and Rachel Crooks is going up against an incumbent named Bill Reineke. Reineke and his family own several auto dealerships in the area.
Bill Reineke has lived in this community for over 30 years. He's well respected. He is a conservative Republican, and this is a conservative Republican district.
Most of our offices are held by Republicans.
Jim Roberts is the head of the Republican committee in Seneca County.
I don't care whether Donald Trump did or did not grab it. Shame on him if he did. Shame on her if he didn't. But that's immaterial to me. I want to know what she's going to do when she gets in the state legislature, because we've had one heck of a good run with our state legislature that we have now.
But Democrats in Ohio are excited about her campaign. Gina Ganny's one of her supporters, and she met me at a restaurant in Tiffin.
The amount of excitement for Rachel's campaign is sometimes a little crazy. But I think there's these stories about these women all over the nation, and that women are just standing up and saying things need to change, and the way we've always done things is not working, so we need to try something else.
I think Trump should be worried at the movement that his presidency has ignited.
Rachel Crooks says she knows she has a tough race, but she didn't decide to run just because of what Trump did to her.
It's more a disgust with politics that allowed Trump to be elected that has driven me to want to be part of it and make positive change.
That report from Tara McKelvey. After 7 years of tough pay restraint within the NHS in England, more than 1 million health service workers are set to receive a pay rise worth at least 6.5%. Most health unions have indicated they'll recommend their members accept the government's offer. It's believed there'll be a similar deal for workers in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And it's likely to lead to claims for big pay rises from teachers and other public sector employees. The head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson, says the offer will make it harder for the Chancellor to balance the books.
Once you take account of inflation, you might actually expect inflation to be around 6% over 3 years. So the real increase in pay over this period, and therefore the real increase in public spending, isn't going to be that big. What it will do is make it harder for the Treasury to hold down total spending, because one of the biggest reasons that they've managed to hold down spending over the last 7 or 8 years is they have held pay below inflation.
Well, as the government worries about total spending, there are other strains on the NHS budget apart from pay, as this winter's experience showed an ageing population and growing demand are also stretching the health services resources. But how can more taxpayers' money be found if that's what's needed? Well, there are suggestions that politicians may be moving towards a ring-fence tax, specifically for the NHS. Professor John Appleby is chief economist at the Nuffield Trust, an independent health think tank, and he joins me now. Good evening.
Good evening.
The question of how to pay for things is a thorny one. When the NHS was established, the intention was to pay for it from national insurance contributions. That was abandoned in the 1970s. Why do you think a ring-fence tax might have appeal once again?
Yes, a ring-fence tax. I mean, I can see the appeal of that. We know, for instance, that through public polling that there is a desire on the part of the public for more money to be spent on the NHS, but also that they may be unwilling to pay more tax. But if you link the two together and say, well, this specific tax, an NHS tax, let's call it, will pay for the NHS, you can see how you could tap into the public's, not only their desire to spend on the NHS, but then their willingness to actually pay more tax.
What would be the downside?
Well, I think there were a number of downsides. So, for example, if you say restructured perhaps income tax and maybe national insurance, or you could take some other taxes, and then that became the sort of NHS tax. I mean, what happens when, for example, the economy doesn't perform very well? It's in recession, tax revenues go down. If the NHS tax revenue goes down, does that mean the NHS gets less money, perhaps just at a time when it needs more money? And I think it's also, some people think it's almost a sort of technical fix that we can somehow bypass those pesky politicians who maybe say one thing and do another, so their promises aren't worth it or something, that we somehow, through this specific tax, we can get around the difficult political decision about what to spend on the NHS.
Well, and some might say, should we be spending more anyway?
Well, I mean, yes. Well, as I say, public polling seems to suggest that at least the majority of the public would like to see more money spent on the NHS, and they may not perhaps trust politicians to do what they say. I think the big problem with the sort of hypothecation argument is, in a way, it's got the thing back to front. Really, you can't get away from the political decision about what to spend on the NHS and how much to spend. It's taxpayers' money, after all. So that's what you need to decide first. And then comes a decision about, well, how do you raise that money? And then you may be into, well, what's the most efficient way of raising the money? What's the fairest way? But the hypothecation argument seems to be putting raising the tax first and then spending later.
Professor John Appleby, thank you very much. Angela Merkel addressed the German parliament for the first time today since she was sworn in for a fourth term as Chancellor. It's been a difficult few months for Mrs Merkel, who's struggled to form a coalition after a poor election result. And now, just a few days into that government, she's already encountering resistance from her own cabinet. Her new Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer, has publicly attacked the Chancellor's positions on immigration and the EU. Our Berlin correspondent Jenny Hill reports.
Like a medieval king, Horst Seehofer holds court under the garlanded wooden beams of an Oktoberfest beer hall. Smart in his Bavarian high-collared jacket, he raises a glass, greets the lederhosen-clad well-wishers who crowd around his table. He's Bavarian through and through. Born here, bred here, he became the Prime Minister of this fiercely independent state, and he's still the leader of the CSU, the Bavarian sister party to Angela Merkel's CDU. But Horst Seehofer has cultivated another role in German politics, that of persistent thorn in Angela Merkel's side. He's been a frequent and vociferous critic, particularly of her refugee policy, an attitude which in part scuppered her hopes for a coalition with the Green and Free Democrat parties. The price of his support for her current alliance with the Social Democrats, a position in her cabinet. But if Mrs. Merkel thought that might keep him quiet, she thought wrong. Already he's been dubbed the Gegenkanzler, the one who opposes the Chancellor. Mr. Seehofer is spoiling for a fight through a series of newspaper interviews.
Islam does not belong to Germany,
He declared, directly provoking Mrs. Merkel, who's publicly said quite the opposite. Then he announced he wants to suspend free movement of people in the Schengen zone.
Germany's border controls must stay for as long as the EU is unable to protect and control its external borders.
And then there was his criticism of the EU's treatment of its eastern members.
The EU has adopted a lecturing tone,
He said, towards Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic over their refusal to take in migrants under a quota scheme. No one's quite sure what he's up to. He's not after Angela Merkel's job. These are, in part, simply his politics, traditional, right of centre, and he's used to high-profile rows as health minister under Helmut Kohl, then food and agriculture minister in the early Merkel government. But most likely Horst Seehofer is playing to the Bavarian crowd. Regional elections are looming. The far-right anti-migrant party AfD has made gains. This state is, after all, where most asylum seekers first arrived in Germany during the refugee crisis. It's just days since Mr. Seehofer and Mrs. Merkel sat beaming side by side as they signed the coalition agreement in front of the press. Above them, a motto, a new unity for our country. But a weakened Mrs. Merkel can't get rid of Horst Seehofer. He's exposing the cracks within her nascent coalition, and he risks playing right into the hands of AfD. Germany's largest opposition party would like nothing better than to establish immigration as the central focus of the new parliament.
Jenny Hill reporting.
Ich habe mir schon als Kind gedacht, was kann denn das nur sein? Wenn die Mutter mir Milch gegeben hat, da wollte ich schon ein Wein.
The Austrian actor Hans Moser singing De Reblaus. Hans Moser was a big star of Austrian film from the 1920s onwards. Under the Nazis, he faced difficulties because his wife was Jewish, but his popularity protected him and he was allowed to keep working. Moser was also the star of a silent film that's been rediscovered, restored, and is going to be shown in Vienna tonight. The City Without Jews was made in Austria in 1924, but with an eerily accurate vision of the future. It's based on a dystopian novel by the Jewish writer Hugo Bataua, and it tells the story of the rise of the Nazis and the expulsion of the Jewish population of a city called Utopia, which is meant to represent Vienna. Dr. Nikolaus Wostry from the Austrian Film Archive was involved in its restoration. He told me more.
The City Without Jews depicts a part of Austrian political problems in the time between the wars. It is a sort of utopia. What would happen if the Viennese would expel their Jews? And it shows that in the end, everybody will lose. Not just the Jewish population itself, but for everybody it will have a very deep impact. What is really very touching is the way how it is argued is coming very close to these Nuremberg laws, which were adopted around 15 years later, and that it is in a way a sort of prophecy.
So yes, a crucial fact, of course, is that the film is made in the 1920s, in 1924, before Hitler's time. How did the film come to be lost and then found again?
The film was in a way a big success. It was screened in the 5 of the biggest Viennese theaters, but very soon it was considered as a provocation by the rightists. In the provinces, Nazis really stopped the film from being screened, and in Upper Austria, this is the province where Adolf Hitler was born, this film was forbidden and couldn't be shown at all. An interpretation was, at that time, it was already due to this prevailing anti-Semitism in Austria.
So there was no copy in existence of the film that was known about until quite recently?
One has to say this is not so unusual with the silent period, because when sound appeared, silent films lost their their value. And the only profit you could make was to destroy them. You could get the silver and you could get the plastic, and that was already the last profit you could do with a medium which has to make money. For that reason, worldwide, 90% of the silent films are lost.
And how did the version that has now been restored come to be discovered?
It was found in Paris on a flea market, and a collector contacted us with whom we had already a long contact and who know that we are very interested in repatriating Austrian film heritage. And so we could get this film back to Austria.
The film itself is based on a novel. Tell us about the man who wrote that novel and what happened to him.
The novelist was also a journalist and a very engaged person for more democratic rights, also for tolerance of homosexuals. He was an advocate of female rights, also of a free sexuality. And 1 year after the premiere of the film, Hugo Bettauer, the author, was killed by a Nazi. So he got the focus as the bad Jewish person who is poisoning our youth and poisoning our society. And in this murderous atmosphere, Hugo Bettauer was killed.
And what about many of the actors who performed in the film?
One has to say this is a very Austrian situation. You have a lot of actors who were forced to emigration. The scriptwriter of the film was killed in Auschwitz. But you also had some actors who joined the Nazi parties, or others who simply stayed in Austria. For example, Hans Moser. He saved his wife since he was a film star in the Nazi period, which Adolf Hitler loved in a way. And because of that, he was able to save his wife. So it is a mixed story, and it shows also different identities in Austria.
The film's been restored. What does it mean to Austrian history? What does it mean to you, looking at your country's history?
In one way, it is much more than a movie or an Austrian silent film. The situation when City Without Jews was filmed is very comparable to the situation nowadays. And we wanted to restore this film, and since we did not get funding for this film from the state, we made a crowdfunding campaign. And it was very clear that people supported this because at that time we had the presidential election in Austria where we had a rightist candidate, and people wanted to show a sign. And there was also the presidential elections in America, and that was also an enormous support from the United States and from other countries, which were explicitly telling us that they're against erecting new walls, excluding people from society. So it had really a very political loading, even nowadays when we tried to restore the film.
Dr. Nikolaus Vostri from the Austrian Film Archive. Tonight's main headline, Facebook's founder Mark Zuckerberg has admitted it made mistakes over the Cambridge Analytica scandal. In his first public statement since it was revealed that the personal information of 50 million users had been harvested from the social network for political gain, Mr. Zuckerberg said there had been a breach of trust between his company and its users. Roger McNamee, an early investor in Facebook and a former mentor to Mr. Zuckerberg, told this programme that much of the company's current problems were down to its decision to get as big as we can, as fast as we can, without any friction from regulators. That's The World Tonight. I'm Ritula Shah. For now, from me and everyone on the programme, good night. You can also find more BBC podcasts at bbc.co.uk/podcasts.